Hey retro gamers, today on Smashing Bricks, we're already getting into the Halloween spirit, busting ghosts and never crossing streams in new Ghostbusters 2. Hey, welcome back to Smashing Bricks, a retro gaming podcast. This is episode 20. My name is Eddie Inzauto, and today I'm joined by Peter Willington of Auroch Digital and the Staying In podcast. How you doing, Peter?
I am doing very, very well, Eddie. How are you doing?
Same, very well. I just got back from a trip to Italy, which was amazing.
Ooh.
And on this trip, I played some video games handheld for this podcast. Even though it's not a handheld game, don't ask me how I did it. We're not going to get the authorities involved today. So, Mr. Willington, you are a new guest on the show. However, we've podcasted before, way back in the, I guess, Big Red Potion times. You were a guest on that show.
Yeah,
what have you been doing since then?
Oh, well, how long ago was that? Maybe
like 13 years.
Like
all right, what are you doing now? Let's go with that. Who are you? Why should the people listen to you?
I'm an ex-video game journalist. I then came over to this side of the fence where I make video games with Auroch here in the UK. So I'm in production, so I help very, very talented, clever people make the thing. So I do that. That's my kind of day job. That's my bread and butter. And then, as you said, there's the Staying In podcast, talking about games and board games and TV and film and all sorts of sort of nerd culture stuff with my pals. And that's how I kind of keep my eye in with the whole criticism thing. I guess I've been on average well. There you go. On average, the last 5 to 10 years, well.
Awesome. On average. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. I love a podcast where you can get all your buddies together and do that routinely. Obviously, it's a different situation here where I have all kinds of people, mostly from a long time ago in my game journalism past, joining me. But that means that I also have to get the audience acquainted with you. So what I've been doing with my new guests is giving you a set of rapid-ish fire questions about your gaming preferences. So, you ready for this?
Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay. This is going to be, fairly quick. First one, favorite game genre. What's your favorite game genre?
Racing, without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah, the more arcadey, actiony, the better.
That's incredible. I think that's a rarity to hear someone say just 100% racing is my favorite genre.
If something goes fast and explodes and is exciting, that's my video game.
It's America. Okay. Your favorite developer or publisher and why?
Yeah, wow. So I would say probably basically anything sweary or Suda51 touches. Not because I think they're the best games, but because it's always a treat when one of those two developers creates something. You know that you're in for something where the heart and the soul of that creator is in it, and that to me is, you can feel that joy, you can feel that honesty, and so I would say if I had to boil it down, I'd probably say Suda. Anything by Suda, so Grasshopper Manufacturer.
That's incredible. I actually just yesterday completed this 25 by 25 grid of favorite games just off the top of my head. And one of those games was Killer 7. I don't know if it's really in my top 25, but I love that game so much.
Yeah, you can't not have a reaction to it. That's what I love about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, next, PC versus console.
Console. So I'm a producer, which means I try and get to the heart of everything. I cut away at everything. And to me, I was growing up when getting a PC up and running and playing all the games was actually quite difficult. So I was always a console kid, and that's always been that's just always been me.
Got it. Okay, speaking of consoles, now we're going to do some console wars. SNES versus Genesis.
Right. Well, I believe we will call it the Mega Drive, Queen's English and all, or King's now, I suppose. But it is the Super Nintendo. Yeah, Super Nintendo. Like, what a system.
Yeah, and I guess I should have said SNES, right? Not SNES. for the King's
spelled
English.
SNEZ.
Yeah. Okay. How about a generation later, the PlayStation versus the Nintendo 64?
Yeah, so for me it was PlayStation. Metal Gear Solid. It was those big adventures. It was that Silent Hill. It was all that lot, and N64. It was old hat to me.
Right. Were you a big RPG guy at that time, or no?
Not a huge RPG fan, but that was definitely part of my formative years of like Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill. Those two had a really big impact on me, and then kind of some of like things like Gran Turismo and some of the more arcadey entries around that period of time, Ridge Racer, that sort of thing. And also I think that was the last era of like the Japanese import, and it was easier to do that with things like PS1. You know, you could go and get very bad versions of the SNK fighters and get them working on a chipped PS1, right? So yeah, definitely the PlayStation, I'd say.
Okay, now for this next gen, we're going to do something I'm calling buy, borrow, or bin. More of the Queen's English. Buy, borrow, or bin. And this is like the classic game, you know what, marry, kill. So
Yep.
This is PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. You're going to pick one you want to buy, one you would just borrow, and one that you would throw in the bin.
Okay, let's rip off the Band-Aid. The Xbox is going in the bin.
Okay.
You can play all of those, like all of the games that you would ever want to play on Xbox, the original Xbox, you could play them on PC. And if you couldn't play them on PC, you could play them not in as good visual fidelity on PS2. The PS2 is the buy, because it has all of the video games that you would want to play on it, like everything that was multi-platform. And then you would borrow a GameCube because there's no other way of playing, your Super Mario Sunshines and your Metroid Primes, right? Like those aren't anywhere else. So that would to me would be a borrow, but not for very long. I think the PS2 was probably my favorite console. So.
Oh, okay. So that makes perfect sense. Well-reasoned answer. What was your favorite console generation?
Yeah, 128-bit. So that Dreamcast, PS2, GameCube, Xbox, it was the era where anything was getting signed and published, right? So things like, this is when, Suda, Swery, that lot, Swery was doing spy fiction. Suda was kind of getting into doing, really kind of very strange stuff. Starting to get into that side of his career. And it's an era where what I always like to think of it is, I think the only right answer for this question is the generation in which a game called God Hand can be made, right? Like you will never see things like God Hand made ever again, because it was just an era of like, go for it. Like it was cheap enough
whatever,
to
try
make
it,
AAA. Yeah, just go for it, right? Like it's the era where it's not much after the era where Konami formed the Silent Hill team because they didn't know what to do with a bunch of developers for a year and they didn't want to fire them. So they just said, just put something out, right? And like it wasn't long after that. And I think budgets were still doable. Games had massive install base, like PS2 still had a huge install base. It was such a glorious time. Yeah. And again, that was the era basically where we stopped talking about graphics, really. Like that era is the era where like we were like, wow, this is all looking amazing. And like all the other generations, they improved everything. But like if you look at something like Okami or something like Shadow of the Colossus, there's not much visually you could do to improve those games. And I think that's the first generation where you go, yeah, there's not really much you could do with a 3D game, in past generations. Like you go look at like the Shadow of the Colossus remake, and it's basically the same, right? Like it looks kind of, very, very similar. And I think the PS2 allowed you to do a lot of, and that whole generation allowed you to do some very clever tricks with the hardware that made things look really good. Yeah.
Awesome. And that's well within the scope of a Retro Games podcast. Okay. Oh, one last question. I almost skipped it. Do you have a favorite game of all time? And what is it?
Yes. Yeah, so I think it's Burnout 3.
Okay.
Like it varies between, depending on how I'm feeling on the day. It goes between, the silly arcade thrills of Burnout 3, or maybe an SSX, or something big, or a big explosive game like that, or something like a Metal Gear Solid 2 or a Silent Hill 2, a lot more thoughtful, that sort of thing. Because those two are the ways that my inspirations for like how games can be different things to different people. That's kind of those games that I see as those benchmarks of high art with those things. But I think probably the way I'm feeling today, it's probably Burnout 3, because it's the way that you remember Outrun feeling, but made by a Western developer, and therefore much dumber, and therefore much cooler. Like it was all of the like near miss mechanic stuff that all came in during that era, like in 3, but it wasn't so boring that you could you didn't have to miss traffic and stuff like that the later Burnout games brought in. It just felt right. Like everything about the vehicle felt right. You felt like connected to it. It was fast. The explosions are some of the best explosions in video games. Like they're just amazing. Great soundtrack, great audio design. The puzzle system is wild. With crash mode, like that's so thoughtful and elegant in an arcade racing game. Yeah, it's an absolute tour de force. I think Criterion just knocked it out of the park with that one.
Amazing. I'm gonna have to get you back on for a racing game at some point. Maybe you can teach me something. Find my favorite racing game and see what you say about it. Sure. But as for today, you chose the game, and it was a game that I had never heard of before. It was new Ghostbusters 2. It is new Ghostbusters 2, which was never released in my homeland. This was a Japan and PAL region only release.
Yeah, how's it feel to have the tables turned? There were so many games that never got released in PAL territories but got US and Japan releases. This is one of the few where that didn't happen.
Yeah.
How's that feel?
Fine. It doesn't affect me that much.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was I was curious to learn what this was. So what is it?
Okay, so new Ghostbusters 2. Obviously, it's a licensed game based on the second Ghostbusters movie, and it takes locations from the movie. It is a top-down arcade, slightly puzzly action game in which you play as two Ghostbusters. You're mostly controlling one Ghostbuster, but you kind of go around in pairs. And you go around these different environments using your proton beam, and you shoot the ghosts with it, and then your partner with you, who's controlled by the AI, comes up behind you, you press another button, and you throw the trap out, and then you trap the ghost. And you go through a bunch of different scenes that are in Ghostbusters 2. Like I say, it's top down. The actual visual style, I would say an almost slightly super deformed chibi Japanese pixel art style to it, because it came out on the NES, but it was from HAL Laboratory, and that is the company that is responsible for, most famously, Kirby. It's like a few hours long, and it's going through these different stages, taking on smaller enemies, lots of different ghost enemies, watching out for sort of, I would say, like almost environmental traps, like things that you need to kind of know are coming up, and then usually a boss fight at the end of every level, and those come in different flavors as well. You might be taking on a couple of different things. You might be taking on a bigger creature, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so HAL Laboratory developed this and published it in Japan. But they had also made a Game Boy version that Activision published in the United States, in North America, and in PAL regions. And that sort of preceded the NES version, which was almost an enhanced version of the Game Boy game, because they were making a Ghostbusters game that was actually going to be maybe good, whereas the first two from Activision and whoever the developer was are notoriously, infamously bad.
Yeah.
But they couldn't get the rights to publish it over here. So it came to Japan in 1990, in December of 1990, which was a few months after the Game Boy game hit Japan in October. And it then came to PAL in 1992, which is a common theme. 2-year delay to get to PAL regions. That Game Boy game also came out a year after the Japanese release in PAL regions, and it came out at the same time in North America as the NES version came out in Japan. That was a really complicated way of saying all that.
Yeah.
But
it's all over the place. The release of it is wild.
Yeah, complicated by the fact that there was already a game titled Ghostbusters II, so they called it New Ghostbusters 2 to make the distinction. The box art is almost the same, it's just a different color. Like there's a black background on the one from Activision and blue on this one, or vice versa, something like that. And even more confusing is that the Game Boy game is just called Ghostbusters 2, the one from HAL Laboratory. Because Activision, they didn't have a different developer for a Game Boy game. So I guess that's how HAL got to develop and send it over to North America. HAL Laboratory is famous for being where Nintendo president Satoru Iwata came from. He was the technical supervisor on this game. And we had director/programmer Hiroaki Suga, designers Shigeru Hashiguchi and Tsuyoshi Wakayama, and the sound designer Jun Ishikawa. Mm-hmm. And that audio we'll talk about later, but I was feeling it. Mm-hmm. So again, this came out just a few months after Activision's Ghostbusters 2 in Japan. That one was April 1990, which was about a year after the actual movie. And I don't really have much information about the development of this title other than they wanted to make this Ghostbusters game, couldn't get the license, so they did it where they could and how they could. Yeah. That's all I've got.
Yeah, and that's kind of the interesting, for me, that's one of the interesting things about this game, because it's one of those like forgotten titles. There's a lot of trash license games out there, right? Especially from this era. I mean, there are a lot of trash Ghostbusters games from this era that are trash, right? And
all of
this
them.
one just, all of them, right? And everyone sort of glazed over the fact that there was this new Ghostbusters 2 game, because I think it didn't get the, I think famously a lot of the retro coverage and stuff like that from, a few years ago was very US focused, like Retronauts and stuff along those lines. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot of love, I guess, for this game because it didn't really come out over there, right? So, and people probably weren't importing this, right? They probably were importing, Final Fantasy from Japan and all that sort of stuff. They weren't importing new Ghostbusters 2. And so, I think it just kind of got lost, which is weird because of, as you say, like, Iwata is like the tech supervisor on this. Like, this is an Iwata joint. And we would look at all of Iwata's other games and be like, oh, magnificent, put it in a museum. But New Ghostbusters 2 is this slightly odd one out, I suppose.
Yeah, especially with Iwata, people will often look back on someone's career, and if they didn't know of a game from when it came out, they would then look at it, right? Like you'll go back and say, "Oh, what did Iwata make? Oh, he made this game. Let me get my hands on that and try it." But still, not much buzz ever about this game, and accordingly, I have no idea of the sales figures. Couldn't find anything. I'm assuming it was not a lot, and there were only a few reviews I could find, and half of them were retro reviews, like from the 2010s.
Yep.
I can go through some of those. NES Player gave it a 5 out of 5. Jeux Video, a French site, gave it 16 out of 20. It was about 80%. Ultimate Nintendo, 80%. 1UP Games, which is not the 1UP that I was familiar with. This is another French website, gave it a 75%. ClassicGames.net, 7 out of 10. And Total UK Magazine, which was actually of the release era, gave it a 52 out of 100.
Ooh, boo.
Whoa. So we have a range here. Quite the range. Some average, some exemplary, and one person just hated it, apparently. So I was also trying to see what else came out around this time. And particularly when I do this, I try to figure out what games are similar. And after playing the game, and you said it's this top-down, sort of arcade puzzly. I'm glad that you used those words. And actually, this was what I was going to talk about before. I was interested to see how you would describe it as far as giving it a genre definition. Because I also felt like it was sort of arcadey, puzzly, ultimately. Like if I had to pick something. So I don't know much about that genre, to be honest, but I do know that HAL Laboratory preceded this game with all 3 Adventures of Lolo games, which are kind of top-down puzzle arcade games. They followed it with Kabuki Quantum Fighter. We said Ghostbusters 2 was earlier that year. Mega Man 3 also came out that year, just as like a big name that was around the time. In December, the same month, we had, again, these games are not necessarily similar, but I know about them. Star Tropics, which is like, it seems to be the most overproduced game I've ever seen because there are 100,000 copies of it in every retro game store. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, hugely popular. And one that I had forgotten about, but I wrote down here, Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu. Wow. Came out the same month. I love that game.
The year of the license.
Yeah. And then just after that, we had things like Double Dragon 3 and Adventure Island 2 in like the next 2 months. Those are just a few that I knew of. Is there anything around that time that you can sort of link to this game as a contemporary or something similar?
Yeah, I mean, not in terms of something similar, because I think, as you say, like it is, whenever we think of genres, I always like to think of, well, in modern times, what's the game that you would say, oh, this directly is referencing that, right? Like you can go and look at something like, the very latest God of War, and you can go all the way back to Double Dragon or Renegade or something like that and say, well, this is basically a version of that, right? Like it's a thing in which you move along a space, you punch things, and then you move on, right? Like that's that genre, right? Whereas I look at something like this and I don't know. Like it's an action. It is an action shooting game. So there's bits and pieces where there are some arcade games that are things like Commando, for example, back in the arcades was a top-down shooting thing. There's a little bit of that to it, but it's exactly. Akari Warriors, those sorts of games, but none of them are quite the same thing. This definitely feels like I like to think of these genre evolutions as being part of like a genetic lineage, and this feels like Ghostbusters is one of those rare like genetic dead ends where they just kind of did the thing and then nobody really picked up the idea and moved on with it. I think if I had to put something else to it, it would kind of be another favorite of mine, which was a game called Gain Ground, which is a top-down action game with shooting in it, but you had to really think about how the space wanted you to approach it. And I think that new Ghostbusters 2 has that as well. Like, the space wants you to think about, through trial and error, how you're going to move through this space in a clever way that means that you don't lose a life or those sorts of things. And it's not necessarily a difficult game, but it is a game that rewards understanding how to play it.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there's not really much else around that time that is anywhere near this.
Yeah. And this game, it never had sequels. Like, there's no lineage, like you said.
Nope.
It's never re-released. I found that a company called Time Walk Games, that appears to be defunct at this point, released a greenish-yellow NES cartridge with all new artwork, a manual, and a poster in 2012. And another one by a company called Mr. Wizard Reproductions was made in what appears to be clear plastic with slime inside, an actual cartridge. And this was in also the 2010s, but nothing else. Yeah, I guess it had like a little bit of a cult following, or at least two people who wanted to see this game remade.
Yeah. But I mean, like, there have been Ghostbusters games where there have been unlockable Ghostbusters games within them, like retro Ghostbusters games. And this is not one of them. Like, it does not appear in any of those.
Forgotten.
Right? The Mega Drive side-scrolling ones do, but yeah, this one isn't.
Yeah. So I never played this game, obviously, as a kid. The closest thing that I ever experienced to it as sort of a lineage sort of idea was on the Super Nintendo, Zombies Ate My Neighbors. It reminds me a little bit of that in a way, but not exactly.
Yeah, it's a great shout. Yeah, that's a really good shout.
It also, thematically, it just happens to be similar too. It didn't have to be that way, but it is, incidentally. So yeah, my past relationship is zero with this game, and I never even played any of the Ghostbusters. I've never played a Ghostbusters video game ever. So this is my first Ghostbusters game.
Banger.
Yeah, and I only just watched the films yesterday and the day before, because I had seen maybe bits and pieces of Ghostbusters 1, but I definitely didn't see the whole thing. But I did watch both of them before this, and now I understand.
Did you enjoy them?
Yes, especially the first one.
Yeah.
The second one kind of took a little bit of a quality dive as far as the film.
Yeah.
But I did learn that this game is pretty faithful to the film, despite also basically being the plot of Bloodborne in a way.
Okay, right.
I don't know.
Okay, let's get into that.
Where this god is trying to be reborn through a baby in the modern day.
So, okay, I have never made that. Wow, okay, I've not made that connection, but that's amazing. And in some ways, actually, thinking about it, Bloodborne is also a game that wants you to move through it in a sensible way in which you understand how you should approach it. You could theoretically move through new Ghostbusters 2 without ever losing a life or taking a hit, right?
Yeah.
Like, it is possible to understand those things and understand those spaces, but maybe that's slightly tangential. But I like that.
So basically, this
link.
is the prequel to Bloodborne, is what we're both saying.
Let's assume that it is. Yeah.
Okay, so what was your experience with the game in 1992 or thereabouts?
Yeah, so as a kid, I grew up like poor, basically. So we grew up real poor. And so I had an NES for the longest time. Like, basically the next console I properly owned myself ended up being, I think it was like a PlayStation 2. Like, that was the first time I got like a new thing. So you can imagine the jump there between NES and PS2.
Yeah, huge.
But I'd go around friends' houses and play lots of different games and that sort of thing. But I had a very small selection of video game cartridges, and you'd get one. It's that classic thing. You'd get one in a year, right? Like, you'd maybe have I would maybe have one a year. But of course, the problem was that because we had this hardware for way longer than its lifespan, the they ran out of games. So like they just weren't being sold anywhere. And obviously my parents didn't know where to get hold of this stuff. So my little library of games that I had, maybe less, maybe 10. I rinsed when I was a kid. And New Ghostbusters 2 was one of them. Over and over and over again. So, and that was that era of like doing that with those games, right? Like there was replay value was a real thing that people genuinely thought about and people actually did. Whereas, now it's kind of a bit of a throwover, right? We think about like just extending the game out longer and longer and longer. Well, for me, it was like, I'm going to go back and play all of these levels because I want to try and beat the game. So I played it a whole heck of a lot when I was a kid. And I was never a massive Ghostbusters fan or anything along those lines. I did watch the movies, as in I had watched the movies, but again, we didn't really go to the cinema. We didn't have any films. We didn't rent films or anything along those lines. So it really was through just like cultural osmosis and maybe around, a friend's sleepover or something along those lines. I might have seen some of these things. So I got basically all of my Ghostbusters stuff out of this one game. And, maybe the cartoons or something like that on the TV. So yeah, I spent a whole heck of a lot of time with this when I was a kid growing up, and for a very long time, I always thought that there'd be more games like this, that people were going to be making more kinds of things along these lines. I never made the connection between this and Kirby's Adventure, which I also had. I didn't make the connection of HAL Laboratory, I guess because I was stupid. But I had both of those games.
I don't think children really are aware of developers. No. I never was until much later. Too
busy drinking Ribena and eating chocolate digestives to care about that stuff. So yeah. It was like a really big influence, I would say, on when I was a kid growing up in terms of playing video games and that sort of thing.
Wow. Awesome. Well, here it is. And we played it again. So that kind of brings us right to this replay. I played through it a few times, actually, this time. I played it this morning again, straight through, with a little ROM hack that changed some of the colors of things and people, which we'll talk about in a second. But I guess we described what the game is. We know it's this top-down sort of shootery, puzzly game where you're collecting these ghosts and moving from screen to screen through a level until you've cleared it entirely, and then you fight a boss at the end, maybe.
Yep.
And there are two guys on screen. One is doing the zapping, the proton beaming, and one is doing the trapping with just the other button. Okay. So what's the first thing, though, that we kind of like notice about this game? Would you say the visuals jumped out at you playing this game?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the presentation of the game opens on a stage, and the game is kind of presented as if it's Ghostbusters 2 in the cinema, and Slimer kind of comes through the screen and goes down the into the audience basically, and the visual detail on these little cute little versions of all of the characters was staggering for me at the time. I always thought to myself, wow, that looks so representative basically of these characters that are on the front of the box, right? Like they're clearly caricatures, but you can tell who they all are. And I thought that was incredible, at the time. I thought the level of fidelity of those was really quite amazing, really. And also just the lushness of its intro flow. So you've got that cutscene to begin with, and you've got this music that's banging out, and it's the theme. Really vibrant colors, really vibrant in that opening sequence, and then the character select is not a simple choose a portrait or something along those lines. It then moves straight into a brand new environment, which is the the Ghostbusters HQ, you know, with the pole and all that good stuff. And you choose which characters you want to take with you, so you can customize your entire loadout of your team. It doesn't really matter. I mean, they don't really seem to have much effect on anything.
They all do the same thing.
They all do the same stuff.
Yeah.
Plus, you could be the little nerdy one, the one who's kind of what's his name?
Rick Moranis' character.
Rick Moranis'
Lewis
character,
was their
Lewis,
accountant.
That's it. And I always thought that was a really lovely little touch. And I always played as Lewis because I was always just like, yeah, like. So there was that little player fantasy of I'm going to be my favorite characters.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you'd select them and then they would go and jump down the pole and swizzle around and all that sort of stuff. And it was more than it needed to be. Like it didn't need to go to that level of depth. It could have just been like, here are the two characters, off you go. Right. Or it could have been just like players. This, you know, Double Dragon 3 came out, you know, around that period of time. Right. And you're just picking from portraits. Like, you know, you're just.
Yeah. Most games,
when you're
I would say,
characters.
You pick your characters from portraits.
Whereas this is
so
like
probably a lot easier UI. To do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty cool. I like that too. It was interesting. So still on the graphics, the sprites are all very small, right? Like you have some games, like think about Punch-Out, for example. Sprites take up the whole screen. And other games, sort of like medium. They're very small.
Teensy tiny, yeah.
And before I even knew that they had made a Game Boy game, I thought to myself, this looks like a Game Boy Color game. But they've done so much with the detail of these very tiny sprites that it's impressive. It's like the best Game Boy Color game graphics there are. And then I find out, they made a Game Boy game prior to this. And it looks pretty much the same, but zoomed in.
Yeah,
so that was
absolutely.
Interesting.
And I think the way that they use that scale is really clever. Because when you're playing through the game, when you're playing through some of these sequences that are, you know, from the movies, like the courthouse scene, for example, which is a very chaotic scene in Ghostbusters 2, you get the sense of scale of this courtroom because the characters are so tiny. Yeah. And when you go up against enemies that are bigger than you, they are much bigger than you. Like they are genuinely quite imposing figures within the space, and it's just you and your tiny little characters, and you feel for them. I kind of empathize with them a little bit more because they are so tiny, and it's them against everything else. I think it does that really nicely.
Yeah, and speaking of those enemies, that was one thing that really stood out to me, was that there is an incredible variety of enemy sprites in this 1990 NES game. There's all kinds of stuff, from the Slimers to the little pink blobs, and then you've got the pumpkin heads with the scythe, you've got ninjas throwing stars, you've got a guy with a knife, you got a chainsaw guy, you've got the ecto running man. There's got to be 30 different enemies. Yeah. Maybe. Something like that, right?
Some of the enemies are... And again, this goes into that sort of lush nature of it. When you're playing through the Ghost Train section, there's a sequence in which you go through a carriage, and there's lots of heads essentially floating around in the space. But they're all different. And they all do the same thing. And they didn't have to go to that extra level of detail, but they're all different. Yeah. And you just feel like, this feels... You know, we call it like premium these days, right? Like we you know, but it was just detail that they didn't have to do, but they did, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, and also from a gameplay perspective, they did a lot of different things with the enemies. Like some would be moving at you quickly, some would disappear and then reappear and attack you. Some would move slowly but very randomly, and some of them would go really fast in a straight line. And there's the one Cyclops that has a morning star, like a ball and chain that goes across the screen and more. Yeah. There's so many different things. There's like the slime that comes out of the bathtub in a straight line, or out of a picture in the art museum. So many different types of enemies that do different things and look different, which I thought was really cool.
And you know, I'm making this comparison. I'm not suggesting it's a one-to-one by any means, but like that thing within things like Monster Hunter, where it's like, okay, this is the enemy and it does this thing, and you are going to have to deal with them in a specific way. Not necessarily like the engagement with the enemy is always very similar, which is basically zap it, hold it for a certain amount of time, and then trap them. But the way that you actually approach that enemy is different. So, like you said, the pink slime that comes out of the bath, you have to know that thing, if you trigger it, you will not be able to get out of its way. So you have got to go around it. Whereas, there's things like some of the enemies are things that you would really like, the teleporting ninja stuff. Those are things that you really want to deal with from far away, and ideally through a wall if you can, right? Whereas some of the other ones, you can get little bit more up close and personal. And some of them you just want to deal with as quickly as you possibly can. Like some of them you want to avoid, some of them you want to deal with really fast. There's lots of different ways of handling them. And I know that's kind of like, there's a lot of games that do that stuff, but you really do have to think about how you're approaching these things if you want to make it through all the way and actually get through the game and see the end.
And part of that puzzle is they're putting multiple different kinds of enemies on the same screen together. So you have to choose which to go for and which to avoid, like you said. In a lot of games, you might just get one type of enemy at a time or two, but this one you could have 3, 4 different types of enemies. So that freeze and capture mechanic, you said we could go through walls, which was one of my main strategies, was trying to get anything I could through a wall or on the other side of a desk or a chair. Oh yeah, that's another thing. The game and each level is pretty much littered with furniture and things on the ground that kind of block your path. You have to go around it or use it to your advantage or deal with it because it can get in your way and cause you to be disadvantaged in combat. For example, when these guys are shooting those morning stars at you, you can't get far enough to the side because there's stuff in the way, so you have to time it to go up and attack them from a safer position.
And each of these spaces, going through the apartments or going into the ghost train or whatever it ends up being, all of these feel like sets that are dressed rather than traditional gameplay spaces, especially from around that era. Yeah, there's like trash everywhere, and you go into some spaces and there aren't any enemies, but in the sort of narrative you're constructing in your mind that ghosts have been here. And again, it's just
like they've knocked everything down.
Yeah,
they've caused the chaos.
Yeah.
So this capture mechanic, the freeze and capture mechanic, is cool, right? I thought it was really interesting and fun, but we've been saying a lot of good things. This is like a little broken. Your buddy who goes to try to get in position to capture them. How does he operate? Let's have you explain how he works.
Well, works is the operative word, I suppose. So basically, when you put the beam onto an enemy, your co-buster will basically run into a position to be able to capture them. And the trap only has a certain length. So when you press the A button, you're pressing the beam. And when you press the B button, you're throwing the trap out. And it's kind of like you can think of it almost like a yo-yo that like flings out, captures the thing, comes back, right? So that's fine if the enemy is dead ahead of you. There's nothing really in your way. You hit the beam, you get them, you hit the button, and the AI gets into position which is usually right behind you, and then throws the trap down. The AI is not quite as good at pathfinding when you're trying to do things like capture enemies through walls, certain walls, I would say, or if there is junk in the way that is particularly like thorny to navigate around. And this is where one of those old school game jank trying to figure out a way of beating the game despite it comes in, which is there are little techniques that you can do, like repeatedly hitting the B button to force your Ghostbuster to throw the trap out constantly, so that rather than... Because what you'll see is that you put the beam into the ghost and then you'll see your partner start to run off in a different direction. But if you catch them immediately, just before they're about to do that, and you get them to throw the trap out, sometimes it's just enough that, well, rather than navigating around all of this different stuff and getting to the space, actually, just as they're about to move, they move into just close enough that you can throw the trap out and catch the ghost. This doesn't work all of the time, and I think that's when the game is at its most I think that's probably one of the areas in which the game is at its most frustrating. It feels like a really good ROM hack could just solve that, just update some of the AI. Yeah, so that to me is that's a challenge, I think. It works, for me, it works about 75% of the time. But again, the thing I think I always have to remember with this game is I have played this game to death, and therefore I know the little quirks and intricacies of that partner character.
Yeah. It's fiddly, right? That's a good word for me to use. It's like fiddly, kind of fiddly, because you have to fiddle with your B button, or like turning your guy around a couple times, because your second Ghostbuster sort of follows your first Ghostbuster's path, but not exactly. Yep. So by moving around, he'll sort of turn maybe get in a better position. But yeah, it could be frustrating. But a lot of the time it worked just fine. And when it did work fine, it was a cool mechanic. I haven't seen it anywhere else. It was awesome. Nice. I did read on the Wikipedia entry that the second player controller could press the B button to do the trap. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's not true, because I tried to test that and it did not work as described. I don't know if you have experience with that.
No, it always felt like a game that could have been co-op, but as far as I remember, there wasn't any way of having a second Ghostbuster as a player character.
Yeah. So if you read that on the Wikipedia entry, it's made up. Don't believe them. What else? So the bosses required you to do different stuff, right? Like, for example, the first boss was the Scolari brothers from the movie in the courtroom. Yeah. They come out and they start flying around in a circle, but there's two of them, and you can't just zap and trap them. You have to hold down the proton beam for a much longer time while the second ghost is still flying around trying to hit you. And then eventually the first one that you're protoning will turn a different color, and then you can trap it finally. And some of the other bosses do different things. So we have the Slimer conductor Slimer on the train, who it just seemed like you couldn't hold the beam on him, so he would turn around toward you and then immediately turn back around, and you would lose the zapping part. So you just had to basically press the two buttons at the same time.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's the difficulty is doing it for the first time.
Yeah,
as soon as you figure out what he actually needs you to do, then it's like, oh, this is really easy.
Yeah. Then later we have the fire salamanders in the sewers, and there are just a bunch of them. There can be as many as 4 or 5 on the screen at the same time, and they disappear and reappear. And you also have to hold your proton beam on them for a long time, but I don't think you have to trap them. But that's rough, because they're spitting fire at you while you're holding the other one. And at this point in the game, I did not realize you could still move around while you were holding your proton beam.
Yep.
That was not part of my gameplay knowledge at this point. And I only figured that out on the next level boss, who is, I think his name is Janosch. It's the character from the movie, who's similar to the fire salamanders in that there's multiples of him. He's really big. He moves around the screen and he spits stuff at you. But he was impossible. I could not figure out what to do. Then I think out of frustration, I pressed the D-pad while I was zapping him, and I said, oh, look at that, I move. And then I figured out you can move. But he's similar. You just hold the thing on him for a long time. And the final boss, how do you beat the final boss?
Final boss is basically find the 3-pixel gap that you can sit between him spitting something out and this weird sort of circling, these sort of like weird orbs that go around him. And you basically just have to lay in tons and tons and tons of fire into this thing. I think that's it. I think that's the end.
He just eventually dies after.
He just goes eventually, doesn't he? So Janosch, I never beat Janosch as a kid. The first time I beat Janosch was literally 2 weeks ago when I was replaying this game for the first time.
Congratulations!
Thank you very much. I'm,
it's been a long time coming.
It's been a long time, and it was
30
desperately
years.
infuriating when I was a kid, because I don't know if you did this, but it's certainly not the most difficult NES game in the world. But if you don't know what you're meant to do, then because there's a live system, it's very easy to get frustrated because it will just kick you straight back to the the beginning.
It's hard enough for a new player.
Yeah, I think so. It's one of those games that a lot of people would probably call like a rental, where it's like the joy of it is seeing everything for the first time, and the difficulty, if what you're in it for is the difficulty, is trying to figure out how to beat the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But once you figured it out, it's not particularly difficult after that.
Because it does have some cheap deaths. It has enemies that will spawn basically on top of you, like the disappearing and reappearing ones. So some of the ones who fly across the screen, I hated the. They look kind of like cherubs with spears, and they're made out of the pink goo from the movie, I guess.
Yeah.
They fly across and hit you. Yeah. And sometimes you don't know where they're going to turn, and you're stuck somewhere in your little hallway space where just the tip of their wing will clip like your toenail, and you get hit.
Yeah,
which is annoying.
There's odd things in the game as well, whereby if you just don't know where you're meant to be going or what you're meant to be doing, it can be really disorienting. I think we miss this a lot in modern games now, which is, the things you figure out in the playground and you go, oh, that's how you're meant to beat the thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And then you go and you figure it out. So, for example, in the train, just before you go onto the ghost train, there is a sort of like subway section in which you're going about an abandoned track, and you can go one of two different paths. And if you go the left path, it's an infinitely recurring loop.
Yeah.
You just keep going and keep going and keep going. And then as soon as you go onto the right path, you go where you're meant to be going. Because like there are sequences in which you can leave through two different very close doors and still come through on the correct side. I think they were just trying to muck around with the players, like kind of imply that you might be getting lost in some way, but they don't stick with the idea for very long. So I can totally see how you might have thought it would be.
It was just that one.
A bug.
It was weird.
Yeah.
And on my playthrough just this morning, I went through it 10 times just to see if anything would happen.
Just doesn't change. Just doesn't respawn the enemies. Just it's odd. Yeah, and you're right. There are some cheap deaths, like I say, I think there are things whereby there's a bit where Slimer is throwing like rolling a food cart at you, and like if you don't know how to beat that bit, you're gonna die a couple of times if you don't know that that's coming. So yeah, definitely repeated plays are encouraged. Again, like a lot of these games were at the time.
Yeah, I felt like the difficulty curve was a little uneven. Like it felt like the beginning I found difficult, then it leveled off, then it got harder again, then it got easier again, then it got harder. It was sort of like that sort of a thing. But I did feel like the beginning was harder than the area just following the beginning. Yeah,
and there are nice little things that they add in that are very odd for the time. Of, I think you press select at the main menu, and it will bring up a secret menu, and it will just allow you to say at which point, like start with X number of lives. At which point do you how many points until you get your next life and all that sort of stuff. And there is definitely a feeling that they do want you to see it all, because I think they're very proud. Like, I get the feeling the team was very proud of what they created. And I think there were a lot of games at the time that, famously, that first Turtles game, for example, where so few people ever got to the Technodrome, right? Like, and that's just a load of work that nobody ever really saw all that often. Whereas with this one, I think they do want you to see. I think they do want you to go and beat, Vigo, and they do want you to see the weird little cinematics that they've managed to squeeze into the small amount of memory on the cartridge and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that whole options menu is baffling to me. Like it's actually more hidden than that. You have to hold down A and B and then press start to get to that options menu. And then you get there and it's literally just the normal options menu that would be in any other video game. It has the difficulty, it has the sound test, and you can change, you can switch the controller buttons from A to B and B to A. That's the whole thing. There's no codes in there. The easy mode gives you an extra life and reduces the number of points you have to get to earn yourself an extra life, which is something we didn't say. As you collect your ghosts, you're getting points, and as you reach point thresholds, it tacks on a life. So it reduces that threshold, or if you go up in difficulty, it makes it more difficult to gain extra lives and starts you with fewer. But why wasn't that just, instead of it could have been start and then press the down key on the D-pad and there's options. Interesting choice.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's because I think when developers make choices like that, especially when so much other thought and care has gone into other parts of the game, I always do sit and go, let's assume this was intentional. Why did they make this choice? And I think it's because they just had a vision for what they thought the difficulty should be.
They just wanted you to experience it the way that they planned.
Like some games at the time, again, like Double Dragon 2, for example, they would let you choose a lower difficulty at the main menu, and then they'd be like, of course, because you chose a lower difficulty, we're not going to let you see the rest of the game.
Oh, true. And that sucked, games did do that, and that was dumb.
And it was dumb. And I think perhaps this is their way of being like, well, this is what the difficulty level is. But if you really can't complete it at this, and we think this is a good challenge, there's this little secret options menu, and that will give you a little bit more of a boost. Because obviously there are things like Game Genie and all that sort of stuff, hacks that you can do with this game. But if you've got those cartridges, but I think they just had a vision for what they thought difficulty was, and it was just like, here you go, this is what we think where it should be.
And I guess it's 1990. Like, they're developing the game with the understanding that Nintendo Power exists, and that options menu is not really all that hidden, because anyone who looks in a video game magazine that this game is featured in is going to know that code, or if your friend has it, you're going to know the code. Maybe they didn't realize that it was going to be such a small release, but the point is that's the environment they were developing in.
And design intention was different, right? Like, the arcade was still very much where it's at, and then the home console was there, but that was what you did when you couldn't play in the arcade, right? And design intention was that's why we have live systems, right? It's this is trying to replicate the fact that the pressure in the arcade is you haven't got infinite money. So for the pressure that the game designers are putting in home console releases is you got 3 lives and 2 continues, off you go. And the pressure is you're going to lose a load of time to it. And I think that it's a weirdly generous thing for them to do, to make the game easier to beat with no ramifications. Like, there's no, this isn't really beating it, is it? There's none of that. And I think, like I say, the design intention at the time was very influenced by the arcade side of things. And this is a game that just kind of seems to want you to see all of it, to see it from front to back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess even the levels themselves are designed where you methodically sweep through every inch of it also, just as an extension of that overall philosophy.
No time limits. Yeah. There's no, it's a thoughtful action game in some ways.
Yeah. The music, before we finish the episode without talking about this music.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
So obviously they've got the theme, and the theme as well is a good rendition, like, of the main Ghostbusters theme from the movies, and that's great. But the actual music throughout the rest of the the rest of it is just absolutely wonderful. I know I've talked a lot about the haunted train, but there is some music and even some sound effects, I would say, that are weirdly haunting, that manage to do a really good job of, the music is like upbeat when it needs to be upbeat, and then a little bit unnerving at times, and really like manages to get a really wide spectrum of sounds and noises into that, especially considering, obviously, you know, this is a time when if you had too many sound effects playing, it would just stop the music, right? And there is a little bit of that when you're playing the game, but it's not nearly as noticeable as you see it in other games, because I think they really cared about this side of it. And I think that extends not just from the music, but as I say, into the SFX. You know, the whistle of the train as it fades into nothingness. The sound of the beam is really like almost weirdly cutesy in some ways, like slightly annoying, but like weirdly like fitting of this sort of chibi art style. The music is, like I say, like it absolutely slaps. It's really so quite good.
Yeah. At first I thought, oh, this is fun music, and like it's kind of simple, and then I thought, it's technically not that impressive. But then as I went on, I was like, wait, yeah, it is. It's awesome. Like all these tracks are really good. The one that's like the Ghostbusters theme, that subway music, like all of it. There wasn't a bad track in the game. Super good. Yeah, and I hadn't even thought of the sound effects either. But when you mention it, I realized that I recall some oddly like static electrical sort of sound effects from the ghosts when you said like a little unnerving. I was like, yeah, you're right. They make like weird ghostly sounds, maybe.
Yeah.
Which
like,
is rough on the NES, you know, like to get that vibe right.
Yeah. It's real rough, but it reminds me of that sort of, you know, 1890s, 1900s, that Victorian obsession with like ghosts coming through electronics as static, you know, the seance through the radio and all that sort of stuff. And it actually works quite well in this here because, like the NES has such a limited sound range in a lot of ways. But Jun absolutely makes it sing. Like there's a ton of different sounds in there. And as I say, I think it's really impressive.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've covered the majority of it, which brings us to final thoughts and what we like to do at the end of each episode, which is decide whether a game lives up to our memory, whether it was worth going back to in 2023 and beyond, and whether you might suggest someone else play it. In other words, is it a smash? And if it's not a smash, well, then it's got to be a brick. So, what are your final thoughts, and what do you rate it, a smash or a brick?
Yeah, for me, it's a smash. Like it's unusual. It's a game that is, if you're a video game historian, if you care about your roots and where it's all come from, this is a weird part of it that has kind of been forgotten, that is bursting with really cool things in it, that makes you surprised that the NES is doing some of that stuff and that designers are thinking around some of these ideas. There are mechanics in there that I think are, some of them aren't quite as perfectly fleshed out as you would want in like a modern game, but there's things there that I think indie designers, for example, could absolutely steal from and make another game along these lines. And it's a strange mix of genres that is very difficult to replicate. And apart from anything else, I think if you like good audio, if you like good pixel art, I think this is one to go and look at.
Okay, so it's a smash from Peter, but from me, what's it gonna be? What's it gonna be? If you could see my notes, listeners, you would see my final thoughts say, ugh, I'm not sure. And I have reasons. So I felt like this game was really interesting, unique, obviously. Like we said, nothing else is really like it, but it does have this mix of genres like you just said. It gave me vibes of a proto Zombies Ate My Neighbors, but in this case you only have one screen to do at a time, and then you get a move on arrow, which in itself is more like a single screen puzzle game. I thought a little bit of Bubble Bobble. You finish your level, you get rid of, you clear the stage, and then you move on to the next one.
Yeah.
But in this game, it's more expansive, right? Because it's not just a single screen, and you actually travel. It's a little bit more of an adventure. So then I thought about, like I mentioned, Dragon Warrior 3 came out right around this time, or 2, whatever it was. And side-scrolling beat-em-ups were similar in that you had a screen, totally different kind of game, obviously, but the premise of clearing a screen, then you get that arrow that says, okay, continue. You've cleared this part, move on. And you go from section to section till you get to the end. So it has a little bit of that vibe from a different perspective with different mechanics. So super interesting. I liked the mechanics in it. I definitely felt that there was that fiddliness to it. I did find that it's repetitive. You're really just doing the same thing throughout the game. There's a good level of challenge. The repetition is tempered a little bit by the level design, which has you maneuvering in a certain way. So it kind of counterbalances that problem a little bit. And overall, I was prepared to come in and say, I had fun with it, but not too much fun. And if you like Ghostbusters, maybe you should play it, but I don't know if I want to give it a smash rating. And it seems kind of like a game that would stick with a person who played it as a kid, but I didn't find myself wanting to come back to it after each session. But then again, I played it handheld on trains while I was traveling, which isn't really great for me for enjoying a game. But then the more I played and the more I got comfortable with it, the more I enjoyed it. But then again, I still wouldn't choose it as the first game to pick up. So ultimately, this conversation was helpful because I do think that it's worth calling a smash. And I think I am going to call it a smash because it has this history. It's from notable people. It's very interesting. It's the best Ghostbusters game you're going to get, basically. Maybe the Genesis one seems pretty good too. I don't know. But it's interesting to play, and there is fun in there, and it has a lot of really good design elements, from the graphics to the music. The level design's good. I wish it were expanded upon. Ideally, it would have a sequel, or it would have a lengthier development time or a bigger team or something that made it a little bit more, or it would have like a Super Nintendo sequel would be cool. Which, Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a similar game on Super Nintendo that is amazing and I love. So it stands to reason, that I would like this expanded out in the 16-bit era. But as it is, I'm gonna go ahead and say, for the love and respect of history of video games, combined with the experience I had with it, I'm going to say it's a smash, and we're going to give it a smash overall.
Awesome.
Whew.
Awesome.
It was tough. I really was coming in thinking, I'm going to give this a brick, and Peter's going to be mad and never going to want to talk to me again.
Oh, dear. It's tricky, isn't it? It's a tricky one.
That was the toughest one for me so far, I think. But that makes new Ghostbusters 2 a smash, and we're saying it is worth revisiting in 2023 and beyond. We did it. So, everybody, thank you for listening to this waffling. And thank you, Peter, for joining me on the show today and for bringing this game that I otherwise never would have played or even probably heard of.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime. We got to get you back for a racing game. And do you want to direct the listeners to something you're doing or somewhere on the internet?
Sure. Go to aurochdigital.com. That's our website. We make video games. Our latest game that we put out is Warhammer 40,000 Bolt Gun. You can play that. It's been out for a little while now. Might even be on sale when you're listening to this. And if you want to find me, then you can come listen to the Staying In podcast, which is available on the podcast place where you are listening to this.
Yeah. All right. So everybody go find Peter at those places and look for Smashing Bricks on your favorite podcasting platform where you're listening right now. And please, if you're listening and you made it to the end of this episode, leave me a helpful and generous 5-star rating and review. It's completely free. But if you want to go above and beyond that and support the show monetarily while getting some fun perks, head over to patreon.com/smashingbricks and become a patron for as little as $1 a month. You can also jump in at the awesome Fireflower tier for $5 and have some exciting input into the show via upcoming Patreon Picks episodes where you get to decide the specific game that we play. Or you can get ongoing recognition or even earn yourself a spot on the show as a co-host for a higher tier on Patreon. But one of the most important perks is for everyone. It will be bi-weekly episodes instead of monthly ones. And once I have enough support, everyone's going to get twice the number of Smashing Bricks episodes. So again, that's patreon.com/smashingbricks. And we're also on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Twitch. You can find all those links in the episode description and at our link tree, which is linktr.ee/smashingbricks. Also, to chat directly and in a sort of cozier environment, you can join the Discord server, which is also linked there, and that'll give you a place to leave commentary about upcoming and past games, gaming in general, food, hobbies, news, anything else you could think of. You can also suggest games to be played for the podcast there, and you can follow the link to the newly renamed Smashing Bricks playlist to either evangelize games already listed there or make brand new recommendations of your own. As for the next episode, I'll actually be giving you a sample of what it's like to have 2 episodes a month because I will be bringing you a special Halloween episode with returning guest Kyle Stallock as we play Night Trap for the SEGA CD. So go get your hands on a copy of that, play along, send in your thoughts, and join us next time on Smashing Bricks. I'm still Eddie Inzauto. That has been Peter Willington. Thanks, Peter. And until next time, may the nostalgia be with you. Woo!
Glorious.
And a final wrap up, just because this was a late addition to an already recorded podcast, but I wanted to get this person their shout out on this episode. We have a new Patreon member named Orlando Workin' Punch who joined as a $5 a month Fireflower level supporter. So thank you, Orlando Workin' Punch. And just a reminder that not only gets a Fireflower level supporter a shout out here, but also handwritten episode notes for what I write down as I play my games, as well as an option to submit games for a Patreon Picks episode coming up. So Fireflowers will get to shape the show a little bit more to their vision. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters, and I will talk to you all next time on Smashing Bricks.